Okay, we will start the session now. So welcome everyone to this session on building the future interoperability for digital public infrastructure. So let me introduce our panelists today for the session. So, first on my left is Liv Martin-Nordhoek, who is CEO for Digital Public Goods Alliance. And then we have Daniel Goldscheider, CEO of OpenWallet Foundation. And then Brenda Maniragwa, project manager for Uganda Pass. And then Lindsay Crumbo, chief investment officer, co-develop. Daniel Goldscheider, Ramesh Narayanan, CTO of MOSIP. Benjamin Bertelsen from UNDP, and Stephanie Delabriole, Executive Director of Secure Identity Alliance. So our objective for this session is to have basically hear from our experts on their views on interoperability requirements for DPI development, the role that standards could play in this, and also in terms of what kind of actions government should consider for DPI interoperability. So as we know, the G20 recognizes DPI as a shared digital systems that could be secure and interoperable and built on open standards and specifications to deliver equitable, and provide equitable access to digital and or private services at societal scale, and are governed by applicable legal frameworks, enabling rules to drive development, inclusion, innovation, trust, competition, and respect of human rights. So there is a general consensus. I'm not going to try to define the DPI, but there is a general consensus that some of the main components that form the core or the basic part of the DPI includes the following: digital identity systems, authorization and consent to enable data exchange in a secure manner, and interoperable electronic payment systems. And you see the word interoperable creeping in already there. Identity systems provide a way for individuals to identify who they are and authenticate themselves when accessing online public services or other services. And we need robust verification mechanisms, such as digital ID verification, and also digital business registries, for example, to ensure the accuracy and authenticity of digital identities. Secure electronic payment systems enable citizens to make payments for services, pay fees, and submit taxes and other financial transactions. And they also support multiple payment methods, such as digital transfers or government-to-person payments, and ensure accessibility and convenience for citizens. We view, for example, digital wallets also to be a critical component of the DPI to enable citizens to prove their identity, hold ID documents, digital assets, travel documents, or digital education certificates as well, in order to be able to gain access and prove an attestation of their digital documents to be able to access digital services. So digital wallets could become critical to DPI, and they should also be secure as well as globally interoperable and governed by legal frameworks. I mean, we heard yesterday the Deputy Secretary General of ITU mention that ITU has established the OpenWallet Forum in collaboration with the Linux Foundation to enable multi-stakeholder collaboration regarding digital wallets to ensure there is a better understanding on the security requirements for hardware and software for digital wallets, best practices for countries who do not have, for example, developed digital wallet infrastructure, and policies and trust frameworks to enable cross-border interoperability for digital wallets. So during this session, we're going to discuss a bit, what is it that makes an interoperable DPI? What are the essential ingredients for interoperability for DPI? So we'll start first with Lindsay Crumble from Chief Investment Officer from CodeDevelop. So I'll give the floor for each panelist in turn for their introductory remarks on the aspect of, what do you think is needed for interoperability, for DPI, the role that standards could play, and what do you think government should consider for DPI interoperability. So we'll hear first from Lindsay Crumble.
Thank you very much. So I actually wanted to kind of maybe take us back a little bit in history and talk about interoperability in one of the most profound ways impacts all of us today, which is through the internet. And before the internet came around, we had a bunch of labs with computers that really couldn't talk to one another. And the internet itself wasn't created by accident. It was created actually through standards, starting off with transmission control protocol, which essentially packaged and labeled information, to internet protocol, which essentially told it where to go. And eventually we had the foresight to actually make this public, so not just between labs, but actually across the world. And that's where you see HTTP, HTML, all these protocols, all these standards that actually have created tremendous value. And now today we have a browser which can support kind of hundreds of different standards and protocols. It's pretty amazing where we are today. And ultimately what the standards does and interoperability does, it actually drives transaction costs down dramatically, which of course drives scale up dramatically. So might be stating the obvious, but I feel like this is kind of like the foundational layer of how we think about interoperability and how it can create tremendous value. And when we think about digital public infrastructure space, unfortunately we don't always bring that sort of kind of scale and interoperability to play, or the digital space rather. In fact, what we've seen is in a number of different countries and different contexts, there's a lot of building of technology that is itself not interoperable. So we're kind of almost going back in time where we have one department with kind of one system that's not talking to another department with another system. And as you can imagine, this creates tremendous amount of both cost, but also, I think, loss in terms of value that can be created both for society, but also for the public sector, which we use to drive significant innovation because of interoperability. So my role as a funder is to help support countries, ecosystem enablers, technology providers, digital public goods, to think about how we can actually start to drive and accelerate digital public infrastructure so we can have these benefits of scale, access, and better value creation to society.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. So now I'll pass on to Liv Martin-Nordhoek from the DPG Alliance for her introductory remarks.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yes. So, building on what Lindsay said, I'll talk about digital public goods that are, in a way, in this context, a means to an end, and how they are a means to interoperability, so to speak, and what that means in practice. So just very quickly, the Digital Public Goods Alliance is a multi-stakeholder alliance. We have many country members, we have UN entities, we have financing institutions, development banks, and stakeholders like GitHub, for instance, and various open source organizations among our membership. We come out of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel that provided a report in 2019 for how to accelerate digital cooperation that could again accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's where the term also digital public goods come from. And we're really talking about open source digital solutions that can help advance the Sustainable Development Goals, but also that meet certain other minimum criteria related to how they have been designed to minimize the risk of doing harm, because most technologies can be used for good or for bad in some way. And when we're talking about then this particular subset of digital public goods that are relevant for digital public infrastructure, we're talking about, for instance, open source solutions that can enable verifiable digital identities, real-time payments, secure data exchange. So really the most foundational technologies that all public and private services build on, and that really are really critical for both economic and societal developments. So it really matters. And if we look at what infrastructure means, there are many definitions of infrastructure. One of those that I really like is that they're shared means to many ends. And that really, it's so critical that they can link to one another, that we get this interoperability, because if not, they are not shared means to many ends. It will be one mean to one end only. And that becomes horribly expensive and also horribly time-consuming if we're trying to advance impact. So digital public goods then, if we believe that interoperability really matters, and the opportunity to make sure that we can be holistic and link different pieces of the puzzle together in a good way. Digital public goods can provide choice in the sense that countries can look under the hood, first of all, and see how these technologies have been built. They don't only get told how they have been built, you can explore it, you can play around with it, you can test if you have the capabilities, or you can hire someone to test for you. Will this work in my context? Will it serve my need? And you can do that before you make a procurement decision. That is pretty important, because you do it pre-big, very costly decision. You can still choose to make a procurement for a proprietary solution, and I don't think everything has to be open source all the time. But we're talking about infra here. We're talking about the things you really need to have sovereignty over. And at least if you then choose to list a proprietary solution, you can see, okay, what are the benchmarks? What should I, at the minimum, expect from this solution based on what already exists open source? So one of the calls to action that I would like to present is to have this idea of open source first policies, of looking into what already exists out there, both as a way of seeing if it can work for you as it is, so maybe you actually don't have to buy something new. Maybe you can build on something that is openly available for adaptation and adaptation, or as a benchmark. And this is increasingly, it's quite widespread now, and one of the things we're doing through the Digital Public Goods Alliance is just also to make sure that there's more awareness among countries of what exists in terms of open source first principles and policies around looking at what already is there that you can build on. And also, I would say for multilateral institutions, development banks, funders, please do that also before you start funding something new, because I think it's not the countries always. There are others that are also sinners here. And my second call to action, very quickly before handing back to you, is around this potential for learnings and best practices among countries in terms of like how they have ensured and addressed the questions around interoperability and making sure things work for them, and what are the traps that they would really recommend others to avoid. So I really encourage countries to join, for instance, 50 and 5, where you have the opportunity to engage with other countries that are looking into building out some of the same digital public infrastructure components and addressing some of the same pain points and challenges that you have, and how you can learn from others and also share your own best practices. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Liv. Yeah, so a call to action here for 15.5 and also open source policies. Yeah. Yay. So let's move to our next panelist. So now we're going to talk maybe on a specific pillar for DPI. So I'll pass the floor to Ramesh Narayanan, CTO of MOSIP.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to attend this panel. Quick note about MOSIP. It's an open source program based out of a university in Bangalore, and we are building solutions for trusted identity and trusted data credentials. And these are available as DPGs, which can be used to build these DPIs. And we want these DPIs to be used seamlessly in different parts of the world and want them to actually make lives easier. So interoperability is something that we keep very much in mind, along with inclusion, scale, sustainability, and trust. As part of our customer engagement, we are actively working with 25 odd countries, and we have 120 million people who have got IDs. And the kind of requirements that we are getting from various customers that we are engaging with, interoperability is not just a need now within the country, where multiple applications can seamlessly use the same infrastructure, whether it is ID, consent, or data credentials, and so on. It's crossing borders actively. So we are working with a set of countries in West Africa who want movement of people from one country to the other seamlessly across the border on a daily basis. Right? Somebody is residing in a town on this side of the border, but then they go and sell their wares daily on the other side of the border. So they are going back and forth daily. Schools on one side are attended by people on both sides of the border. So there are so many use cases where people are moving freely. There's free trade happening in various zones. All of this, if it has to be enabled, then the systems between these countries, they have to be able to talk to each other, right? And paper is a very inefficient way of doing it. Digital systems can be efficient, but imagine that these solutions are disparate, work in different ways, then actually instead of helping, these digital systems will come in the way. So working on common protocols and common standards is a must. But when these regional groups are being formed, what's actually in one sense that's happening that we have seen is that the silo is moving out of a department into a country and then maybe into a region. But we still have regional silos. What we need is true global interoperability. And the call to action, as Vijay was asking, my request call to action is that we need these various unions, whether it's the European Union, the African Union, the ASEAN, all these bodies to work and agree upon a few common set of standards. It doesn't have to be one winner or anything like that, right? But a few. We can't, every time we need to buy a knife, we can't buy a Swiss Army knife with 100 things or carry a travel adapter all over the world. Unfortunately, I bear the brunt of traveling to many countries, and the day I forget my travel adapter, I'm dead. Because you don't have these multi-adapter places in most of the places I travel to. The default plugs don't work with what I carry. So this kind of challenge is what people can face on a daily basis. So interoperability has to be truly taken at a level where everyone is included. It's not just the convenience for the people who are designing the system for their context alone. I think that's it from me for now. I think we have other questions coming up later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh, and thank you for highlighting the importance for global interoperability so that DPI can be inclusive as well. So now let's move to maybe Daniel Goldscheider, CEO OpenWallet Foundation. I mentioned the importance of digital wallets. Maybe Daniel, you can maybe elaborate a bit on that, on your introductory remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Vijay. I would like to start with a couple of thank yous for Stephanie. The Secure Identity Alliance has been a founding member of the OpenWallet Foundation, and to Ramesh, Mosip is a member of OpenWallet, and thank you for also contributing code, which is fantastic. And of course, thank you to ITU for being our partner with the OpenWallet Forum, and for UNDP to be a part of the OpenWallet Forum, and of course, Lindsay, thank you for being one of the donors to the OpenWallet Forum. I'd like to ask the audience a question. Who here thinks that standards are the key to interoperability? Can you quickly raise your hands? Okay. And who here thinks that open source is the key to interoperability?
I think both.
Okay, you think both? Good. So, when we think about interoperability, obviously, open standards are crucially important. We heard about the internet, right? Take HTTP and HTML away from the internet and there is literally nothing left. But as Lindsay said, Google told us that there are over 700 standards that factor into a web browser. So when you have hundreds of standards, even though they're all standards and they're all open standards, it becomes a really challenging problem to solve. So when I think about interoperability, I think about a train. It's a train that is leaving Geneva, incidentally the headquarters of ITU, and it goes to the Swiss Alps. And for almost 100 years, people got on the train in Geneva. Mid-journey, they would get off the train, get on another train, and then finish their journey. Why? Well, the reason is simple. The gauge of the tracks changes. When you go up the Golden Pass, you start with normal gauge, and then over time, you go to narrow gauge. And so you stepped on a train that was adapted for normal gauge, and then you went to another train that was really adapted for the narrow gauge. If you take that train, if you take that journey today, there is no more need to change trains. And the reason is that the new train adapts. It can leave Geneva, and as the width of the train tracks changes, it can adapt to that. So the reason I am boring you with train stories at a digital congress is we believe that our wallets need to work like this train. If physical rails change, you need trains that can adapt to different physical rails. If the identity rails, the payment rails, the metaphorical rails change, then we need wallets to adapt to different rails. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring as many developers as possible together to create open source components that allow wallets to work with any credential format, whether it's ISO MDL or MDoc or NONCREDs or W3C verifiable credentials or SDJOTs, any protocol to transmit those credentials, any trust framework in any country. And we're also interested to have countries be part of that, because digital wallets are one of those areas where companies like Apple and Google and Samsung really care, but so do most countries, because wallets are the home for your digital identity, for healthcare credentials, for academic credentials, for central bank digital currencies. So the idea is really to bring both together, and this is why we are incredibly excited to start on an experiment. The OpenWallet Foundation is at home at the Linux Foundation, which is the world's largest open source project. Of course, Linux itself, but also almost 1,000 other open source projects. And of course, the UN, in many ways, is the Linux Foundation for countries. This is where countries go to work together. And so the hope is that this partnership between the world's largest open source project and the ITU and the UN system, with code hosting going to happen at UNICC, that this is really the beginning of something new. An idea of governments and companies working side by side with a shared understanding that the P in DPI, the public in DPI, doesn't mean that the code can just come from the public sector. It means that what we're building should be in the interest of the public, in the interest of everyone here. And we hope that we can really create this coalition of the public and the private sector to do it together.
Thank you, Daniel, for your insight on the topic of interoperability here for the wallets. Let's move now, following on the topic of standards, and let's move to hear from Stéphanie Delabriol, Executive Director of Secure Identity Alliance.
Thank you, Vijay. Hello. Thank you for having me on this panel. And while we are in the thank you, I would like to thank Daniel for being founding member of the City Hub initiative that I will talk about in a minute. And I would like to thank Vijay for inviting me on this panel, because we do a lot of collaboration with ITU, so I'm really happy to be here. So we heard already a lot of information, but I wanted to go back to the source. You know, when we talk about digital public infrastructure, we talk about identity, but let's get back to, you know, the role of government and legal identity. So one of this, you know, digital public infrastructure is identity, but this infrastructure also breaks into different functions. I mean, we always forget, you know, we get an ID card or a passport, we think it's easy, but behind the scene, you know, for governments, there's a lot of systems, you know, there's a system for your civil registry, there's your population registry, you have your system to, you know, if you have biometrics, you need a system to manage that, you have your UIN system, you know, if you decide to have a unique ID number, then you have to issue your credentials, so that's another system. So it's different building blocks, exactly like in a bigger digital public infrastructure. So you need to make sure that the data that is being processed, you know, within these building blocks actually can go, you know, flow from one block, one system to the other. And this is where SIA actually worked on the development of a standard. We put, you know, around the table governments and industry, and together we defined, you know, the way this data should be exchanged. And this has been recognized by the ITU and is now a standard. So, you know, one of my calls is to really encourage government to implement this standard, and you will get interoperability within your system. So that's really to issue credential, you know, documents. And then, as we heard already, you know, once you have your, you know, you've created your foundational ID, your legal ID, which is the role of governments, you may have different models in the way you are going to consume, you know, use this ID. So some, you know, and this is going to be really linked to you know, the legal framework of the country, the culture, the history. You know, there's so many parameters. There's not one country that is similar. You also have countries that, you know, together are creating regional. I mean, we have regional frameworks. We have, you know, intergovernmental frameworks, but it's going to be different everywhere. And the future is going to be very interconnected. I mean, it's already, but it's going to get even bigger with digitalization, and decentralized, because you know, we want a public infrastructure that is, as we said, centered on the, you know, inclusive, centered on the people. So the trend is really to have this system decentralized. But if you have standards, then they can, you know, the data can flow in between those systems. So going back on the use of this identity, we heard it, there's many, many standards, and as soon as you go cross-border, you know, your neighbor may not have chosen the same standard. Then you go across sector. As we know, there's standards per sector, you know, agriculture, payment, you know, you name it. So together with you know, for instance, my colleague from OpenWallet Foundation is involved. We've launched an initiative last year called City Hub initiative, together with all the open standard organization, to actually create this interoperability between the different trust framework. So, you know, you can have exactly like today, you have a passport, you go from one country to the other, and it works in every single machine, every single gate, you know, when you pass the border. You need to have that in the digital world. You know, you need to have a wallet being able to roam in another country if you access a service that is across border or across sector. And together, so all the open standard organizations are involved, and we have a liaison with ITU to eventually, you know, have all this work channeled to them for standard, you know, to make it standard. And this is what we do: interoperability between standard, making sure that when you have a wallet in a country, the way, you know, your identity basically is used, you know, across border and sector in the digital world. So, you know, find what you have with a passport today in the physical world. You need to recreate that in the digital world. And this is what City Hub is all about. And my call here is to get involved. I mean, involvement, we have involvement from all those non-profit, but we have a lot of governments involved, and any government is involved because we want to make sure that all the needs are taken into account. You know, so this is my call. You know, if you're interested, just come and see me after this panel session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, excuse me. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for your intervention. I'd now like to pass to Brenda Maniragwa, the project manager for Uganda Pass, for her intervention, please.
Thank you. My fellow panelists have clearly spelled out interoperability and the standards, and I just want to take this on an example basis. I'll start off with work with the National IT Authority in Uganda, and beyond the mandate of regulating, promoting, and the use of IT or digitalization, we also are charged with the implementation. Now, if I take an example of our version of the X-Roads, what we call UG Hub, it brought data integration applications together, and all entities are supposed to come here and exchange their data. What I've seen there in the interoperability of that has birthed innovation, because now you're going to see different entities come on here and they say, I'll give an example. If the registration authority was to come and they wanted to consume services from the tax authority, then they're going to have a portfolio of what the tax authority does. And then they'll be like, oh, okay, there's something else beyond just the e-tax number. Maybe they have something on, what can I use, your land services. And they're like, maybe as the registration authority, we can actually expose a service that combines these two. So it has been an active birth to innovation of how interoperability has birthed innovation from from building onto existing ideas and just forming new ideas altogether. So that has actually caused, but also if I push that into what standards will help us do with that. Now with the standards, we'll be able to, yes, we've brought all the people together to come and innovate and build onto what we have, but things like the different technologies that they're using are going to differ, and what we'll need there is going to be something that's going to point them to build better, have better data exchanges, have common security features to look out to. And on top of that, it's going to just, oh, sorry, I lost my point. So, but what I would like to defer to now would be, how are we going to call our government to help us on this? What is the call to the government in these areas? So let's talk about awareness, because we have the DPIs already there. How about, and it doesn't work only with the people directly involved in DPIs, and that's normally the standard, the policymakers, the digitalization people, but let's educate everyone about DPI. Let's educate everyone about these standards. Let's cut across beyond different government entities, beyond the different sectors that are across there and the general public. Because again, if it's a well-kept secret, it's not going to achieve its full potential. So my call here will be, much as we are, if we take the example I've given, much as we are seeing the benefits, we're building innovations, and we're going ahead to now build the right standards to make sure that we are doing it securely, we are doing it properly, and and we're making it easier for other people. By having these standards, we're making it easier for a set of guidelines to make it easier. Let's actually not keep it a secret. Build it, talk to everyone else, agriculture, go to health, go everywhere else. I gave this an example because I tend to see, as making joke with a few of my previous panelists, it's the same faces we see every time we're talking about DPI. We would want to see what's DPI doing in the health sector, what's DPI doing in agriculture, what is it doing for the mechanics and the robotics out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these insights, Brenda. So let's move to our next panelist and the final one, Benjamin Bertelsen from UNDP.
Thank you, and thanks Venkatesh for arranging this this panel. So quick note on UNDP, we are, well, the UN as the Linux operating system for countries is a new one. I'm not quite sure where UNDP would fit into that one, but we are the premier development organization within the UN system with about 20,000 people spread in 130 countries supporting implementations of projects there. About 20 DPI projects actively ongoing, a little bit depending on how you count. And a thank you also to the fellow panelists here on the board who's been either supporting with financial resources or with their knowledge to our recent DPI Safeguards Initiative for setting up some guardrails for DPI through principles, practice, and processes released last week during UNGA. I don't want to repeat what's been said here in terms of the importance of interoperability, very much agreed in terms of that for DPI. In many sense, I think we can think of DPI or the DPI approach as a priority to get the foundational building blocks in place. That could be through DPGs, as Liv was mentioning, and maybe a little bit of a steer away from creating siloed solutions that work for specific contexts and specific providers. So focusing on getting that foundational horizontal infrastructure in place that will then enable others to build new applications on top, whether it's in education or agriculture or other areas. And for that, interoperability is naturally key. When that is said, we've had interoperability for a long time now. I mean, countries have been using interoperable solutions for a long time. Secure servers, API, JSON formats, XML, or what have you. So the question then becomes like, why is it not in more countries? Why do not more countries have a solid interoperable infrastructure? And seeing from UNDP side and from what we're seeing, it's very much has to do too with the political economy of implementing like big countrywide solutions and the knowledge of DPI, the capacity in government and private sector in order to implement. So Brenda was a little bit in on this point too. If I can just give two examples from some of our work in UNDP on this. My team, we were doing a governance assessment on ID and DPI in a sub-Saharan African country a couple of months back. And we were talking with the nodal agency there, who were very competent, by the way. We were going through different use cases for interoperability and for shared data exchange, and there were plenty being mentioned. We were asking, okay, how many of these are live today? How many are working? And they could point to 2. And we're saying, okay, how long have your data infrastructure been in place? They're using an X-road system. And they said 8 years. So, okay, 8 years, why not more use cases in place? And they said, well, I mean, we go to our IT departments in our line ministries, and they can barely keep afloat, just with the basic things of keeping their stuff afloat. So coming with a new use case, coming of doing something new, working together was just too much. So pointing to a lack of capacity generally within government to pull these things through of working through these solutions. Another country we were supporting, Malawi, we spoke with a local actor down there who'd done some analysis in terms of the system landscape of Malawi and the critical systems for enabling DPI in the country and true interoperability between sharing data between government agencies. And this institution, they had assessed there were about 70 vendor-locked systems in Malawi, which prevented good sharing of data in the country. So this makes it tough. Like you have that many systems which are locked, which is again is a product of lack of expertise, lack of capacity in order to do those contracts, in order to unlock those systems again. So interoperability is very key, but so is the necessary capacity in countries and knowledge. Fortunately, seeing from our side, the conversations we're having compared to 5 years ago and then now, we're much further. There's much more awareness around the importance of this, the awareness of openness, of interoperability, of open standards, getting that into contracts, enforcing it all the way through. And the DPI movement has been a good push, a good train towards that.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. So now we'll move to our second part of the panel, where we'll have a conversation maybe with the different panelists on the interoperability journey for DPI. So let's go back a bit on what Daniel said regarding standards and open source software. So maybe I have a question for both, maybe Daniel and Liv. So how do you see the role of standards versus open source software in achieving interoperability in DPI? Maybe Liv first and then Daniel.
Thank you. And I asked to get that question up because it's and Daniel, thank you for really sort of prodding that. So I think, and I would love to have the participants engage in this because there's the whole train and engage metaphor made me just, there's so many things here, and I'm going to try to just provoke a little bit of discussion. So when we talk about open source, the whole idea is it's access, it's adoptability, it's adaptability, and it's like if MOSIP shuts down tomorrow, as in triple ITB, if the building burns down, if MOSIP stops, those who are implementing MOSIP, they can fork it, right? So they have their own implementation. They may not, yes, there's no supporter, maybe tons of challenges. It's not like forking is not easy. So it's not what I'm saying, but at least you know that you have something, even if the shop closes down. And then we go to standards. Because standards, they are about you don't want standards to change randomly, right? The whole idea is that you want usage of the same standard, ideally. I guess we would ideally want fewer standards, as long as we knew they were in the public interest, right? It's not the more the merrier. But who has the power to define what those standards are? And we never talk properly about that. So we say, yes, these are open standards, but there is not a uniform definition about what open standards are. If you look at, there's many definitions, and what they imply is completely differently in terms of who has power. And I would love, again, a call to action. Can we agree on what we mean when we say open standards? Is it enough that you can freely use the standard that I have decided, and but I can choose to change tomorrow, and then it's a bit sad for you. And has the standard, so the gauge, when that was defined, is it based on the billions of trains that I already own? And so I believe the public interest is because I already have 1 billion trains, that is the gauge we set for those tracks. And that's the discussion we're having in tech today, because, and first of all, I very much admire what Daniel is working on, and I think it's a fantastic, I'm not saying I think it's a good aspiration, but at the same time, let's not be naive about who's around the table defining what the public interest means. One thing is everyone invited in to sit around that table? And I think, yes, Daniel is really trying to bring everyone into the room. But can everyone afford to, do they make the trip to participate at that conference in that country? I am 100% certain no. Can everyone, does everyone have the internet to even be able to participate in that virtual discussion? So it is those that are already having the resources. It's very easy to have people working full-time to be a very, very active part of defining what the public interest is, and that is not fair. So I genuinely believe in open standards, but I believe there is a lot of open washing around what the real open standard is, and we have to talk about governance, who makes the decisions, and not only talk about you can use my standard, which is a great open standard. So that's, sorry about that, maybe a little bit of a rant, but it's just we have to talk about the elephant in the room sometimes, so I threw it out there. Sorry.
Okay, Daniel?
Yeah,
yeah, clap, Julia.
I would.
We had one round of applause for that.
Dave, I actually agree with what you're saying. I think, just because you have a standard or just because you open source something doesn't mean at all that it's inclusive. So I can have a piece of software and I can open source it, and you can make pull requests and I can simply ignore those pull requests, right? So the whole reason why something like the Linux Foundation exists is because open source is not enough. You want to have an open governance layer on top of open source. So you want any developer basically that is interested to contribute, you want that developer to be able to make pull requests. Now, when you say that some people may not even have the internet, that is a huge problem, that some people, even if they want to contribute, to a standard or to a piece of code cannot, because they don't have the means. And I think, I will never forget this conversation we had with an expert group on standards for wallets. And there were a lot of people who were very excited about ZKPs, zero knowledge proofs. And if you care about privacy, you should be excited about ZKPs. And I remember it was someone from MOSIP who said, yeah, but what if the only thing you have is a feature phone for a family of 8? Or what if you only have a piece of paper with a QR code? So, we need to recognize, I think, that some of the things we want are maybe not mutually exclusive, but at least factors pulling in different directions. If you want to be as inclusive as possible, you're not going to be as secure and as privacy preserving as possible. If you want to be, conversely, as privacy preserving as possible, you end up with very expensive devices and very demanding code, and it's not going to work everywhere in the world. So I would say there are some legitimate issues where there are legitimate interests that run in different directions, even if you are incredibly well-intentioned. But then you also have situations where maybe a company, a country, maybe even a non-profit organization doesn't really have the best interest of the public in mind. And that, of course, is a whole different story. So I would hope that people, companies, check their competitive instincts at the door when they are trying to work on DPI. And I would hope that governments really have the best interest of their citizens at heart. Even if you do, invariably you will find some things where there will be a trade-off. And so as far as OpenWallet is concerned, we are not picking standards and we're not picking software. We're not saying this is a good credential format and this is a bad credential format. Because many countries, sovereign countries, have very different ideas. There is one very large country where within that country, within one ministry, 2 factions are pulling in different directions. In this case, different credential formats. And that's within one country, within one ministry. I think it would be completely wrong for Europe to say, well, 27 countries agreed on the EUDI framework. Now we should really tell the entire world to use that. There is a lot of amazing work happening in many different places. There are many great standards. They have pros and they have cons. And I think we need to find a way to bring people together without trying to pick a winner, and certainly not top-down saying, we're the OpenWallet Foundation or the ITU or the OpenWallet Forum, and we tell you this is the right credential format.
Okay, maybe on the same question, maybe let's hear from Benjamin.
Sorry, I'll need that question one more time.
So how do you see the role of standards versus open source software in interoperability for DPI?
Thank you. Well, I think they play a complementary role. They're different, but they play a complementary role. I think as is basic, the open standards, they form the foundation rules of the game, if you will, for proceeding, whereas the open source are the technical tools ready to go out with and implement. And therein, that open source, they can be digital public goods, which will then give you an ability to quickly pilot, as Liv was saying, or attempting to be agile and testing out what it is you would like to implement, whether it's government or private sector, and then move ahead. So I think, in short, they play a different but complementary role.
Thank you. Maybe I think on this panel, I think different panelists mentioned the importance of cross-border interoperability for the DPI and also for the different components of the DPI. Maybe can you maybe elaborate a bit maybe on the challenges that we face for cross-border interoperability? Maybe Stephanie?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Just before, I wanted to insist on, when we developed, Liv, I wanted to comment on your, what you said on open standard. I think you're right. It's very important to have the whole community involved, including, all the regions of the world. And this is what we did with OSIA, involving really, the governments right from the beginning. So having a community that together, really build a consensus and look at how to share the data, which is the philosophy of building standards. It's really based on, usually on consensus, but we also built it with governments. And CD Hub that I was mentioning, the same. It's an initiative where right from the beginning we made sure we involved governments from everywhere in the world. And we want to continue that. It's really important so that we take into account, it's a chance for all the government to take into account local use case that could be really feed, into the work that is done on then global standards. Regarding the cross-border, in emerging economies, we know it's the same problem than in, developed countries, except that there's less resources, the system may not be mature. This morning, UNDP, Cheyenne was mentioning, the difficulty to find developers, everywhere. So this is totally exacerbated in emerging economies. So that's something that you really need to take into account when you develop DPIs. And this is where standard again can play a role, because you don't have to go full, digital public infrastructure at once, because as we heard, we know that there is sometime existing infrastructure. Sometime, if you want to go open source on a new system, you need digital skills, you need the capacity. So you may want to do a mix and match, and this is where standard really help, because standards, it doesn't matter if it's open source or not. You can make choices on some bricks that you will purchase, some bricks you will develop to try, and develop innovative application. So thanks to standard, you can do that. So I think it's important. I don't think it's gonna accelerate, this DPI agenda, but we're not gonna, transform in 5 years. It's a lot, and we need, all this. Plus, one thing that is important, it's not like even just developers, because we will have a chatbot and AI to do the code. We're going to need people who actually know, how to design a system and apply it to the use case that you want to develop. So it's even more skilled people. So I think that's, something that we need to bear in mind.
Thank you, Stephanie. Now a question maybe for all the panel members. So how can digital public goods play a role in enabling interoperability for DPI? So let's start with Ben, maybe.
I think Liv should take that one.
I'm biased.
That's why I didn't give her the floor first.
So Ben handed over the word to me. I didn't ask for it. So I will be super quick because I went a bit long on the previous one. And standards matter if they're used and widely adopted. And I do think that the increasing adoption we're seeing of DPGs now are also driving standards adoption. So it's coming that way. And wherever possible, standards should be open. And I do, I'm adding calls to action as we speak here. I was just in another panel on the digital commons or an intervention there. And the one thing we agreed on there was that at least there should be transparency. When we call a standard an open standard, we should be transparent about how are decisions made about the evolution of that standard, who governs it at least, and how do they make decisions. And then I think we all can agree that it's impossible to have every individual in the world and every stakeholder in the world decide on a standard, but at least we should know how decisions are made. So I would love to call for at least some minimum agreement of what we mean when we say open standard. But yes, DPGs are driving standards because DPGs are, wherever possible, built on open standards. And where DPGs are increasingly then more widely adopted, these open standards are also more widely adopted, which enhances interoperability. And if you need to build an extension, if the DPG doesn't have the full interoperability needs you have, you can also build extensions. So you have the opportunity to adapt.
Okay.
I'm done.
Daniel, maybe next.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I am biased as well. I think it makes sense to look at the browser world. You know, browsers, again, 700 standards. They all use a couple of code bases. You have Blink, Chromium, which is used by Google Chrome, by the Microsoft Edge browser, the Opera browser. And anyone, you know, if you and I wanted to build a browser tomorrow, we would probably build it on one of those open source projects. But when you look at the browser area, they are open source, but they're not necessarily open governance. So I think the opportunity we have in the wallet space is to do what's being done in the browser space and really base wallets on open source software, but ensure that no single company or country is trying to define the stack for everyone else to use. That really everyone has, to Liv's point, as much of an opportunity as possible to be part of that open source project, which obviously should be based on open standards.
Okay. Lindsay?
Sure, on the DPGs?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'm a big fan of DPGs, just like Olive here. So we fund a number of digital public goods at Co-Develop, and I think their contribution to this interoperability discussion as well as to DPI is, I mean, in many ways, the design principles that a lot of DPGs have that support DPI, which is that they're interoperable, they're modular, they're often using open standards, and they're extensible. And so what this does is it essentially sort of unlocks this interoperability layer that we've talked about, can unlock tremendous benefit to society and tremendous benefit, I think, in terms of public innovation at a reduced cost. I'll do one more add-on because I think everything's already said, which is that we did a kind of quick look at some Gartner research in terms of just how much every country is spending on their IT budget. And what we found was that essentially a handful of the wealthy countries were spending $250 per head on IT annually. And the whole rest of the world, which is 5.5 billion people, was spending roughly $15 a head. And we said, so why is this? Is this better technology? The answer was absolutely not. In fact, the technology that wealthy countries were often using was these kind of non-interoperable, full-stack solutions. And so digital public goods actually can play, I think, a key role in both driving down costs, but also in thinking about how to kind of create this interoperable layer that can create and unlock value for the public as well as private sector, and ultimately, that's the benefit to society that we think can be driven through DPGs.
Thank you, Ramesh. Same question.
Thanks, Vijay. See, I'm an engineer, and when I'm trying to solve a problem, I look for the shortest path, typically. That's a tendency. And I also am an entrepreneur. I've done a couple of startups. I'm looking at cost optimization, quick solutioning, solving the core business problem, not spending all my time on the plumbing, right? When it comes to DPI, let's remember that DPI, the I is for infrastructure. We are actually talking about the plumbing, right? As much as possible, we should have the plumbing already implemented, ready to quickly import and use, and not an expensive solution. If it is an expensive solution, people are going to keep it away and find other shortcuts, right? That's how people solve quickly and cost effectively. And in the process, they end up ignoring standards in many cases. That's where the interoperability is lost. The effect of that is not felt immediately, but later. And by the time, especially governments, they don't have the experts to evaluate the interoperability during procurement or during testing. And these specification standards are very complex, right? And they cannot actually spend a lot of time doing this. But then they discover this when they try to be interoperable. And by the time that procurement cycle is gone, maybe the software is in maintenance, they have to start all over again. Which is why having DPGs, which follow standards, is so important, at least for the infrastructure level, right? There are all kinds of DPGs. There are DPGs at the infrastructure level, like the ones that we are building, and there are ones that are at the application level. At the application level, I think there is a lot of scope for innovation, and I believe there's huge opportunity for both closed source, private sector, as well as open source solutions to be there. But at infrastructure level, I do believe that to keep innovation possible and easy, we have to keep the costs low and the implementations a few, the standards themselves also a few, And I think that's where the role of DPGs for DPI is super important. And obviously, this infrastructure also needs to be kept up. So we need to have, for critical infrastructure, the solutions, we need to have the wherewithal to support and sustain these initiatives for the long term. Because governments are in the business of continuity. They focus on real problems. They don't want to keep worrying about the plumbing over and over again. Right? So as a community, we need to figure out how to solve at least these core infrastructure level solutions, which enable multiple usage, multiple purpose on top of that to enable digital transformation, transactions, and applications across the globe. I can tell you there are several DPG folks sitting in this room. They're all working on reusable solutions, where if it's solving something for farmers, they will solve for education using the same stack and the same set of tools. That reusability and lowering the cost, being able to transfer this benefit to the customer, comes from being able to work in the DPG model and have friendly open source licenses. So for critical components which enable, I think we should be at the DPG and open source layer, following standards, which is very important, right? So that interoperability is also ensured.
Thank you. Brenda, you want to add anything on your side?
All the points have actually been talked on, yeah, especially the modularity and also being cost effective. I can't say more. I think I'll save the time.
Okay. Thank you for that. Maybe one last question. We've talked about interoperability at the level of the different pillars for the DPI, but no one spoke about interoperable payment systems. And interoperable payment systems is actually a very costly exercise, and integrating different payment systems and infrastructure to facilitate interoperability is technically challenging. So maybe for Benjamin here, how can international organizations and SDOs maybe play a role there?
So the role of international organizations in supporting interoperability?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think in a couple of different ways.
So it's for interoperable payment systems.
For interoperable payment systems.
Yeah.
Well, going back to the political economy in countries, thinking about what it requires if you want to roll out an interoperable payment system in a country, those who've worked in government or advised government or even a big private sector company knows the type of coalition building and coalescence it requires of actors to come together and agree on something, especially when it's about infrastructure, because infrastructure tends to be sticky. Once it's there, it sort of stays there. So for payments, you'll need banking sector involvement, Ministry of ICT, Ministry of Justice, likely a couple of watchdog organizations as well, a Ministry of Finance, it's maybe a Ministry of Economy as well. Each of them might have a couple of nodal agencies. They'll also have an opinion. Now add in a developing country context where there will be a couple of development actors as well, probably UNDP, probably World Bank, maybe whatever regional development bank is there, who might also have some views upon this or willingness to help. There might also be donors who might have specific preferences about a certain system, maybe a system from their own domestic country that they want to implement. Now, my point is here that interoperability can be sort of a cheat code for the immense coordination that will need to happen. Because if we can agree that interoperability and open standards is the default, then we can still live with a little bit less coordination, because the open standards and the interoperability will or could take care of some of it on the other hand, because you can implement one system by one actor, another actor can implement another system, whether it will be payments or other areas, and the interoperability can sort of take care of a sometimes messy, if we're honest, development and technology environment in countries. The other role that international organizations can play can be in transfer of knowledge between countries, how countries have done it and be able to facilitate that exchange. And it can also be tapping into global expertise for countries to support with and to share.
Thank you very much, Ben. So we are also running out of time for the panel. Maybe as a closing for the panel, maybe I'll ask each member very quickly to just give me, you know, if I were to ask you what would be a call to action to be considered by governments for DPI interoperability as a key takeaway for this session, maybe I'll give you the floor, each of you in turn. So maybe we start with Liv. What would be your call to action on your side?
I think I mentioned many. So, but short, open source first policies to make sure you check what already exists. I loved what Ramesh just said about trying to solve the problem and just taking the shortest path. And then join 15.5 if you're implementing safe, inclusive, and interoperable digital public infrastructure. And then for all of us to agree on open standards.
Only one call to action.
Okay, 3 calls to action. Sorry.
Daniel.
Join the OpenWallet Forum, please.
Brenda.
Yeah, mine is still on awareness. Get the word out. Let everyone know what we're doing.
Thank you. Lindsay?
Mine is, I think I'd suggest to countries to actually use the DPI approach, but to start with the use case. It doesn't have to be everything all at once. Just start with the single use case and go from there.
Benjamin?
Just one?
Yeah, just one, yeah. We don't have time for more.
Okay, I can see Liv is looking at me, so I have to say join 15.5. No, but do.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Should I say the same? No, do get involved as governments. So I know you're going to have a lot of initiative to get involved with, but we do talk to each other. So I'm sure we can find a way. But please get involved because your local needs, are required to make sure the standards we develop are actually inclusive. Important.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have time to take questions from the audience, but you can interact with the panelists afterwards. So please join me in applauding our panelists for this intervention. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. I didn't hear you said one.
Group photo, okay.